Hey guys, in today's video I want to give you some alternatives to shooting with the Hasselblad XPan for handheld panoramics. And by photographing panoramics, I don't mean stitching together a series of shots you took with a tripod of a cityscape or a landscape. No, I'm talking about handheld panoramic photography, documentary and decisive moment style, where you are framing your story in a panoramic aspect ratio. For you digital photographers, this will be a new concept for you because unless you're just really good at envisioning the panoramic frame lines in the viewfinder and go in and crop it that way in post, chances are you've never shot this way. And there's a very good reason for that. Digital cameras with their standard fixed aspect ratios don't lend themselves to a panoramic format. Sure, you can stitch together a pano taken on a tripod, but what about street photography? Digital camera manufacturers aren't in the business of leaving megapixels on the table, so they want sensors that are largely filled by those circular lenses. But with film, on the other hand, as it rolls across the shutter, it's more natural to expand the amount of film that can be exposed horizontally. And the most notable film camera for handling panoramic shooting is the Hasselblad XPan, otherwise known as the Fuji TX1 and TX2. Those of you who've shot with it or who follow several noteworthy street photographers who do shoot with it on a regular basis, you'll appreciate the appeal of the format. I think there are many reasons that many of us are drawn to the wider aspect ratio, and one of the biggest reasons is actually the same reason why we appreciate the wide cinematic look that an anamorphic lens can provide on the big screen. As humans, we have really amazing peripheral vision, and in some regards, our peripheral vision has strengths that our center gaze does not have, and we're more used to having wider access to what is in front of us than most photo aspect ratios can provide. Personally, I find it both challenging, but also just extremely rewarding to notice and capture a moment that lends itself to that wide frame. And even with small subjects in the frame, it can be a very interesting challenge to deal with all that negative space surrounding it. But those of us who are drawn to that style of shooting are faced with a bit of a dilemma, as the options for handheld panoramic photography are extremely limited. The camera that was literally built for this, the really remarkable Hasselblad XPan, is prohibitively expensive for anyone but the most ardent of collectors. To get a decent used one, you're going to be looking at shelling out at least $3,000 US dollars currently. And by the way, I wouldn't advise doing so, as it's becoming more and more difficult to have them repaired. As parts are long gone for these and there's no way to shoot them in fully mechanical mode, you could be investing in what could end up being a very expensive brick at any time. And from what I've read through the years in the film photography forums where people have talked about the XPan, this has happened to a lot of people, and it's only going to get worse as the already dwindling stock continues to age. So if you're like me and you regret not buying the XPan 2 years ago when they were selling for an $800 price point, which back then I thought was crazy, what options do you have today? Are there alternatives to film or digital that can give you the experience of shooting handheld panoramic photography without taking out a second mortgage on your home? That's the question I've been working on for over a year. Not because my research has been extremely diligent, it's mostly just because I got really distracted in 2018. But I'm finally ready to share with you 7 options that I know about that are alternatives to the Hasselblad XPan. We'll start with the cheapest options and progress to the most expensive. But before we do, I know I'm going to get some heat in the comments from folks who won't appreciate or understand all of these solutions. They will see some of these camera options as unnecessary and won't understand what they will see as artificial limitations placed on oneself for the sake of a photo that may well have worked better in a more typical 3:2 or 4:3 ratio anyway. To you folks, I want to say 3 things. 1, you're not wrong. Many of these solutions can be silly and artificially limiting, but 2, all art is created by artificial limitations. One of my favorite creatives of all time, composer Igor Stravinsky, said, "The more constraints one imposes, the more one frees oneself from the chains that shackle the spirit, and the arbitrariness serves only to obtain precision of execution." In short, limits can increase creativity. And the third thing I'll say to you is that I personally love having new challenges in my photography. It keeps it all interesting and fresh. I can go back to old locations or subjects with a fresh take, but some people, they're just not going to understand that, and I guess that's okay. But enough of that. Let's talk about some handheld panoramic solutions. And the first solution I actually don't have anymore. It got thrown away. But the good news is that these are everywhere on eBay, flea markets, garage sales, etc. And what I'm talking about here is almost every point-and-shoot camera from the 90s. Many of these cameras have the panoramic mode, which all that meant was that some frame lines would pop down to cover part of the film to create that 29:1 or whatever aspect ratio. Of course, this is a significant artificial reduction in quality, but what this gives you is an easy way and an extremely cheap way to frame your handheld panoramic scenes. The next solution I found is going to appeal more to the Lomography crowd rather than the serious photographer, but I'd be lying if I claimed I didn't at times enjoy photographing the world from the Lomographist's point of view, and this camera can certainly be a lot of fun. This is the Lomography Sprocket Rocket. This is essentially a toy camera, all plasticky and basic. It includes a wide, near fisheye plastic lens and extremely inaccurate viewfinder. This is about as basic as a camera gets, with everything being fully manual and extremely bare bones, but it does shoot panoramic. If I can get this rear thing off, you can see how wide the film exposure area is. Because the winding knob is really just, you know, manually turning the spool either to wind or rewind. This actually can work great for double exposure shooting. The focus control is complete guesswork here. You have a scale from, I don't know what this is, 1 meter to infinity, I guess. I think that's a flower, and I believe that's a mountain. So, you know, just a lot of guesswork there. The shutter speeds, there are 2 shutter speeds. I'm not sure what the shutter speeds are. I couldn't find it in the manual. I guess I could use my shutter speed finding app to detect that, so I guess I will, and I'll put it on the screen. But essentially there's a dark mode, or a cloudy mode, I guess. You wouldn't want to shoot this in actual dark situations, a cloudy mode. And then there is the full bright mode. That's it. The Sprocket Rocket gets its name because of this one interesting feature. You can remove a back cover. It's not here. I need to find the back cover. This is the back cover. You can remove that from the back of the film holder, and that will expose the sprockets, which gives a really unique look that your hipster friends are just gonna go nuts for. So that is an option for you, but for me, it's just too much of a toy and the photos are just too wildly distorted. It's fun to take along every once in a while for playful style photos, but it's not a camera I'm gonna reach to if I want decent dock or street style panoramic photos, and it's definitely not a replacement for the Hasselblad XPan, sadly. This next camera wins the award for the camera that gets me the weirdest looks. This is the Horizon S3 Pro. This is a Russian camera that has gone through many iterations during its existence, but they have all had the same basic philosophy. The lens rotates 110 degrees using a battery-free clockwork mechanism. It exposes the film as it rotates. The lens is a 28mm 2.8 lens. It is focus free, meaning you can't focus it. You just have to know what is gonna be in focus and what is not based on your aperture and the resulting depths of field. And if you're not very smart like me, you're probably gonna get it wrong a lot. So what I've resorted to doing is just not taking photos of anything close, at least if I want them to be in focus. With this camera, you'll be able to take 22 photos on a normal roll of 38 exposure film. It also has a bubble level on top to help you keep your horizon line nice and straight. And that can be helpful, as shooting this in the circular manner is gonna give you a fair amount of distortion. Keeping the horizon line straight will minimize that. But I guess that's the biggest thing about this that makes it a non-viable substitute for the XPan for me. The photos are just too warped. I guess I also hate the way it looks. But if you find that off-putting, but you do like this style of panoramic shooting, there are 2 other Japanese brands you could look at, the Noblex and the Widelux. Both of them have the same design philosophy, but those are much more expensive options. The next possibility I've explored is converting a medium format or 120 film camera into a 35mm panoramic camera. And there are actually several ways to do this. Some of them are more kludgy than others. For example, there are kits that you can stick in the Fuji GW690 or the Pentax 6.7, which will allow you to roll 35mm film through them. But these options are extremely fiddly and make them non-viable as a legitimate substitute for the XPan, in my opinion. But the other option I explored and that I like the most is this 35mm back that you can stick on the back of your Bronica ETRS-I. While certainly not as enjoyable to use or as subtle as the XPan, there is a lot more flexibility in this solution. You can add grips, you can add different prisms, and of course different lenses lenses. And while the ETRSIs are generally pretty common on eBay and fairly affordable as far as medium format film cameras go, the 135 back for it, this guy right here, is extremely rare and quite expensive. But certainly it's not as expensive as the Hasselblad XPan, so I consider it a viable solution. The Bronica 135 back is quite ingenious, and I really wish someone would make more backs for other medium format cameras that work like this one does. It's a lot more straightforward to use than other Kluge solutions for the 35mm on medium format cameras, and the image quality you can get out of this solution really just puts all the other options I've mentioned previously to shame. The next camera is one that I came across by chance exploring Bellamy Hunt's website, aka the Japan Camera Hunter, and that was an article about an earlier version of this beauty. This is the Panoramic Oxygen, and the story behind this is pretty amazing. If you look closely, you'll notice that this is actually a 3D printed camera. It was designed and crafted by a 19-year-old student, Oscar Oessen from Switzerland. When I learned about Oscar, I reached out and asked him if he'd be interested in having his camera in this video, and he agreed, though at the time he had sold all his prototypes. I agreed to wait for a month and a half for him to get this built and to get it shipped to me, as I really think this is something special, and this video wouldn't have been complete without it. To be clear, this is a prototype, so it's certainly not perfect, but for what it is, it's quite impressive. The Oxygen is a 24 by 65mm camera that is all manual. The design is very appealing and it has some nice finishing touches. For instance, the design of this latch on the rear door. It has this magnetic cover that can slide out and keeps everything nice and tight. It's a really cool solution that he created here for an otherwise overly complex latch mechanism. His solution for the lens and shutter is also really clever. He uses an M65 helicoid and the Copal 0 to M65 adapter. The lenses are interchangeable and there are several options, but they need to be able to be remounted to the Copal 0 shutter. Set up like this though, most of the operation of the camera happens just all right here, similar to how a large format camera would work. I haven't had this camera very long and Oscar needs to get it back, but I've had some fun with it while I've had it, and if you'd like to try an Oxygen, his plans are available on his website if you're into 3D printing. Either way, what Oscar is doing here, it's really awesome, and I really look forward to seeing how his Oxygen cameras continue to progress and improve. So those are all my film alternatives to the XPan, at least the ones that I was able to find and explore. If there are any that I've missed, please let me know. But before you go, there is one more camera that I want to talk about and that provides a panoramic style shooting, and what we have here is the really odd, truly remarkable, and vastly underrated digital camera that most of you will have never heard of. It's the Sigma Quattro H. Now, there's a lot that can be said about this camera, and I'm sure I will be doing a much more thorough review of this camera in the future that no one will watch. But in the meantime, let me give you a quick rundown before I get into why the heck I think it's a viable alternative to shooting with the XPan. Sigma utilizes their own Foveon X3 sensor, which has a very unusual design. Rather than the traditional Bayer filter, which creates a mosaic of red, green, and blue sensitive photosensors, the Foveon sensors utilize a red, green, and blue layer so that each photo sensor captures a true color value. So instead of approximation of color values in a mosaic like every other digital camera in this world has, the Foveon sensor claims 100% accurate color, and it works much more like film cameras do. Now, I'm not sure about color accuracy, but what I will say about this sensor and the images that it produces is that my first reaction to the photos were, wow, it looks like I'm shooting with Portra. It has a very filmic look to it, and I absolutely adore the colors. But as cool as all that is not the reason I bring this camera up. The reason I do is because it is the only digital camera I know about that you can crop in camera in panoramic ratio. Sure, plenty of cameras will give you a 6:9 cinematic format, but the Quattro H gives you a 21:9 ratio, and I find it extremely enjoyable to use. Now, plenty of you will be scratching your heads right now and wondering why the heck I would leave all those pixels on the table. Why don't I just cover up the top and the bottom of the viewfinder or the LCD and just crop the whole thing later? And you're absolutely right, that would be completely acceptable. But for me, there's just something about composing and shooting all in panoramic ratio on a camera that truly supports it that I find both challenging and liberating, and I really wish other camera manufacturers would just put in that 21:9 crop. But as cool as that in-camera crop is, the camera is very challenging for other reasons. One byproduct of that foveon center is that unless you're shooting in black and white, ISO values for anything pushed past the 100 look really crappy. Additionally, let's be honest, it's a pretty ugly camera, and this one is even more ugly, as the person that I bought it from had somehow allowed their dog to get a hold of it and use it as a chew toy. It works fine, but it's not going to win any beauty contests. Additionally, although I think the 35-1.4 is really a fine lens, I don't feel super great about the autofocus it has in street situations. I did find a way to mount vintage screw mount lenses though with a small, very small M42 adapter that can be placed on top of that Sigma SD mount. And so I'm excited to play with that more with other M42 mount lenses. In conclusion, as I look over my collection of cameras, I'd say that although a couple of them, namely the Bronica and the Sigma Quattro H, are viable and I will continue to shoot with them, none of them are quite what the XPan is. If you've learned of any other alternatives to the XPan that I have missed, please let me know. But in the meantime, all we can really do is continue to hope and pray that the XPan is re-released, or even better, a digital version. Fuji, get on it. But that's all for now, guys. Long live film. We'll talk to you again real soon.